Anthony Castellano stepped out of the car and into the brisk autumn air of Westbrook, a small town far removed from the chaotic sprawl of Chicago. The high school loomed before him, a red brick building that appeared to have weathered decades of adolescent drama. For a fleeting moment he hesitated, clutching the straps of his worn backpack, as if it could somehow shield him from the unknown. "Blend in," he reminded himself in a hushed voice, repeating the mantra his father had drilled into him before sending him here. This wasn't just a relocation. It was an escape. Anthony's father, Vito Castellano, wasn't just any man. He was the shadowed figure behind one of Chicago's most powerful mafia families. For years, Vito had kept Anthony insulated from the darker aspects of their life. But the inevitable whispers of danger had grown louder. Sending Anthony to Westbrook was Vito's attempt at ensuring his son's safety and perhaps his innocence. Inside the bustling corridors of Westbrook High, Anthony's first impression was one of overwhelming noise. Students laughed and jostled each other, slamming lockers and exchanging playful insults. Anthony's heavy frame moved awkwardly through the crowd, his gaze fixed downward to avoid eye contact. He found solace in the furthest corner of the cafeteria, where he could observe without drawing attention. Despite his efforts to remain unnoticed, it didn't take long for some students to pick up on his presence. His quiet demeanor and stocky build made him an easy target. By the second day, 3 boys had already marked him as fair game. Mark, the self-appointed leader of the group, had a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue. Dylan, wiry and quick, excelled in provoking others, while Brad, the muscle of the trio, loomed large but followed Mark's lead unquestioningly. It began with whispers behind Anthony's back, small remarks about his size and his awkward gait. But by the second week, the antics escalated. In one particularly humiliating moment, Mark deliberately collided with Anthony in the hallway, knocking his books to the floor. "Watch it, big guy," Mark sneered, his grin wide and unapologetic. Anthony crouched to retrieve his belongings, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment as laughter erupted around him. Mark, Dylan, and Brad stood triumphantly over him like predators who had found easy prey. "Say something, why don't you?" Dylan goaded, leaning in close. Anthony didn't respond. He merely gathered his books, stood up, and walked away. Inside, his blood boiled. Back in Chicago, the Castellano name would have been enough to silence these boys with a glance. But here in Westbrook, he was just another nobody. That evening at home in the modest rental Vito had arranged, Anthony stared at the family photograph on his nightstand. His father's stern eyes seemed to gaze back at him, as if demanding to know why he had allowed himself to be humiliated. "Don't fight back," Vito had warned before Anthony left. "This is your chance to be normal, to stay safe. Handle things quietly." Anthony clenched his fists at the memory. How could? He explained to his father that safety came at the cost of dignity. The next day, the pattern continued. Anthony found solace in his biology class, where the teacher, Mrs. Harper, had a knack for making science engaging. But even there, he felt the sting of exclusion as students naturally gravitated toward their established social circles. Anthony sat alone, sketching mindlessly in his notebook during lab activities, his only interaction limited to nods or polite one-word responses. By lunchtime, he was back in his corner of the cafeteria. From across the room, Mark spotted him and nudged Dylan and Brad. With a conspiratorial grin, Mark grabbed a carton of chocolate milk from his tray. "Watch this," he said, his voice low and malicious. As Anthony stared out the window, lost in thought, Mark approached from behind and upended the milk carton over Anthony's head. The cold liquid drenched his hair and shirt, pooling onto the table and floor. Gasps and laughter erupted around them. "Oops," Mark said mockingly, feigning innocence. "Slipped." Anthony froze, his breathing shallow. He could feel the sticky chill of the milk soaking into his clothes. But worse was the hot flush of humiliation burning beneath his skin. Slowly he rose from the table, his broad shoulders hunched. Mark stepped back instinctively, perhaps sensing the flicker of fury in Anthony's eyes. "Don't," Anthony whispered to himself. Without a word, Anthony picked up his tray, set it in the bin, and walked out of the cafeteria. The laughter and murmurs behind him felt deafening, but he kept moving. Later that night, Anthony sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. The idea of retaliating gnawed at him. He had grown up surrounded by men who handled problems with their fists or worse, but Anthony wanted to be different. He needed to be. Still, the memory of the milk dripping down his face refused to fade. The next morning, Anthony took a detour on his way home from school. He had noticed a small, run-down boxing gym in the town square, its faded sign reading Jenkins Boxing Club. Inside, the smell of sweat and leather filled the air. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s stood near the ring, barking instructions at a pair of sparring teenagers. His presence was commanding yet approachable, like a general who cared for his troops. "Can I help you, kid?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but kind. Anthony hesitated. I want to learn how to box." The man, Robert Jenkins, scrutinized him for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough. Name's Robert. Grab some wraps over there. First lesson's free." As Anthony clumsily wrapped his hands, Robert called out, "You box to build yourself up, not tear others down. You ready for that?" "Yes, sir," Anthony replied, a determination sparking in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Here, in this cramped gym, he could finally start to take control of his life, one punch at a time. The heavy bag swayed violently under the force of Anthony's punches. Sweat dripped from his forehead, soaking the tape around his knuckles as he threw another jab, followed by a right cross. His breathing was ragged, his arms aching, but he didn't stop. Each strike was fueled by frustration, the sting of humiliation, the weight of expectations, and the fear of losing himself in the shadow of his father's reputation. "Control your breathing!" Robert Jenkins barked from across the gym, his voice cutting through the rhythmic thudding of leather against leather. "You're wasting energy swinging like that." Anthony stepped back panting, his hands dropping slightly. Robert approached, a towel draped over his shoulder, and his weathered face set in an expression of both critique and encouragement. "Boxing isn't about rage, kid. It's about focus," Robert said, handing Anthony the towel. "Out there," he gestured broadly, as though referring to the world beyond the gym, "losing control gets you hurt. In here, it gets you knocked out. Breathe, focus." Anthony nodded, dabbing his face with the towel. He wanted to explain why he was there, why he needed this so badly, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, he simply returned to the bag. This time, keeping his movements deliberate, his punches sharp and precise. Days turned into weeks, and the boxing gym became Anthony's sanctuary. Under Robert's guidance, he learned not just how to punch, but how to stand, how to move, and how to think strategically. The drills were grueling, hours spent perfecting footwork, dodging punches, and building endurance. But with every bead of sweat that hit the mat, Anthony felt a little stronger, a little more in control. At school, the changes were subtle at first. Anthony walked with his head held slightly higher, his shoulders squared. The cafeteria bullies noticed too. Mark's smirk faltered the first time Anthony met his gaze without looking away. It wasn't defiance, but it wasn't submission either. It was something Mark hadn't expected. Resolve. "He's acting weird," Dylan muttered as they watched Anthony pass by their usual table. Mark shrugged, though his eyes narrowed. "He's still the same loser, just thinking he's tough now." But even Mark couldn't ignore the whispers that had begun to circulate around school. It started when a sharp-eyed student spotted a man in a tailored suit walking into the principal's office, a man who bore a striking resemblance to the infamous Vito Castellano. Speculation spread like wildfire. "Do you think he's in the Mafia or something?" One student whispered to another as they passed Anthony in the hallway. "Maybe he's in witness protection," another suggested, only half joking. Anthony heard the murmurs, but pretended not to notice. In truth, they terrified him. His father had sent him here to escape the family's reputation, not to see it follow him. Yet no matter how far he ran, it seemed the Castellano name would always cast a long shadow. The tension came to a head on a crisp Friday evening. Anthony had just finished a particularly grueling session at the gym, his muscles screaming in protest as he trudged to his car. The lot was nearly empty, bathed in the amber glow of a flickering streetlight. He barely noticed the three figures, emerging from the shadows until it was too late. "Well, look who's been playing Rocky," Mark sneered, stepping into view with Dylan and Brad flanking him. "Been hiding something from us, Castellano?" Anthony froze, his fists clenching instinctively. "What do you want?" Dylan held up his phone, the screen illuminated with an article about the Castellano family's alleged criminal empire. "Is this you? Big scary Mafia kid pretending to be normal?" Anthony's jaw tightened. "That's none of your business." Brad chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "See, that's where you're wrong. You made it our business when you showed up here, thinking you could just slide under the radar." Anthony felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. "Leave me alone," he said evenly, stepping toward his car. Mark moved to block his path, his grin widening. "Or what? Gonna call Daddy's goons? Or maybe you'll throw a few of those fancy punches you've been practicing?" The taunt struck a nerve, and before Anthony could think better of it, he dropped his bag and squared up. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. Mark laughed. "Too late for that, tough guy." The first punch came from Dylan, a wild swing that Anthony dodged easily. He sidestepped, pivoting on his back foot the way Robert had taught him, and countered with a quick jab to Dylan's shoulder. Not enough to injure, but enough to make a point. Brad lunged next, his size making him slower, but more dangerous. Anthony ducked under the swing, landing a solid hook to Brad's side that made him stagger. "Stop!" Anthony shouted, his voice cutting through the scuffle. He stepped back, his hands raised defensively. "This doesn't have to go any further." For a moment, it seemed like they might listen. Dylan was nursing his shoulder, and Brad was doubled over, struggling to catch his breath, but Mark wasn't done. With a snarl, he charged at Anthony, tackling him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment, Anthony saw stars. But then the hours of training kicked in. He twisted his body, using Mark's momentum against him, and managed to flip them both over. Pinning Mark's arms to the pavement, Anthony leaned in close. "I'm not like my father," he said through gritted teeth. "But if you push me, I'll show you exactly what I've learned." Mark's eyes widened, fear flickering across his face. Anthony released him and stood up, breathing heavily. He grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder, his gaze sweeping over the three boys. "Next time, walk away," he said before turning toward his car. As he drove home, Anthony's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He wasn't proud of what had happened, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he had stood up for himself on his own terms. Later that night, as he sat alone in his room, Anthony replayed the events in his mind. He couldn't shake the fear that this was only the beginning. The Castellano name had been his shield and his burden for as long as he could remember, and now it was a powder keg waiting to explode. But as he looked at his bruised knuckles, he realized something else. For the first time, he didn't feel powerless. He had the tools to protect himself, and no matter what came next, he was ready to face it. The autumn wind howled outside Anthony's window as he sat at his desk, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop. He was supposed to be finishing an essay for English class, but his mind was elsewhere. The confrontation in the gym parking lot had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He kept replaying it in his head, the wild swing of Dylan's punch, the dull thud of Brad hitting the ground, the raw fear in Mark's eyes when Anthony had him pinned. He'd managed to defend himself without crossing a line, but it felt like a hollow victory. The whispers at school were growing louder, and it was only a matter of time before the truth about his family spilled over. Downstairs, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught Anthony's attention. His pulse quickened. His father had sent him to Westbrook to escape the Castellano name, but it seemed like the family business had followed him anyway. Anthony hesitated at the top of the stairs, listening intently as a knock echoed through the house. His mother, his father's most trusted confidant, opened the door cautiously. "Mrs. Castellano," a man's voice said, deep and formal. Anthony leaned closer to the railing, catching a glimpse of the visitor through the narrow gap in the door. The man was dressed sharply in a black suit, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the porch light. He handed over an envelope, nodded curtly, and disappeared back into the night. "Anthony," his mother called up, her voice tense. "Come down here." He descended slowly, his heart pounding. His mother held the envelope out to him, her expression unreadable. "It's from your father," she said simply. Anthony took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. "Anthony, I hear. You're making a name for yourself. Remember why you're there. Keep a low profile. If things get out of hand, call me. Vito." The note was short, but its message was clear. His father wasn't blind to what was happening in Westbrook, and he was reminding Anthony to tread carefully. "Does he know about the fight?" Anthony asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother's lips thinned into a straight line. "Your father knows everything, Anthony. You need to be careful." The next morning at school, the tension was palpable. Students glanced at Anthony as he passed through the halls, their conversations halting abruptly. Even Mark, Dylan, and Brad seemed more subdued than usual, sticking to their corner of the cafeteria and avoiding Anthony's gaze. But the unease only grew when, during lunch, a sleek black car pulled into the school parking lot. It wasn't flashy, but its polished exterior and tinted windows stood out among the sea of rusted sedans and hand-me-down SUVs. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark suits and sunglasses. They moved with an air of authority, their presence immediately drawing attention. One of them carried a briefcase, the other scanned the area with sharp, calculating eyes. Anthony's stomach dropped as the men entered the school. He recognized them instantly, associates of his father. In the principal's office, Mr. Richards straightened his tie nervously as the men took seats across from his desk. "Good afternoon," one of the men said, his tone polite but firm. "We're here on behalf of Mr. Castellano. He's asked us to ensure that Anthony's time here remains undisturbed." Mr. Richards nodded stiffly, his discomfort evident. "Of course. We always strive to provide a safe and supportive environment for all our students," the man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. We trust that any incidents involving Anthony will be handled with the utmost discretion." Outside the office, Mark lingered near the door, eavesdropping. His heart raced as he pieced together what was happening. By the time Anthony got home that evening, the damage was done. The whispers had turned into full-blown rumors, each one more outlandish than the last. "He's got bodyguards now," someone had said in gym class. "I heard his dad runs the mob," another added. The final straw came when Mark decided to share his newfound research with the school at large. Using an old newspaper article he'd found online, he circulated copies of an exposé on the Castellano crime family, complete with grainy photos of Anthony's father. When Anthony arrived at school the next day, the evidence was plastered on lockers and bulletin boards. Students stared at him as he walked down the hall, their expressions a mix of fear and fascination. At lunch, Anthony's usual corner was occupied. Mark sat there with Dylan and Brad, the article spread out on the table in front of them. "Hey, Castellano," Mark called, smirking. "Want to sign this for me? Maybe write 'Best wishes, the mob boss's kid'?" Anthony stopped in his tracks, his fists clenched at his sides. The entire cafeteria fell silent, all eyes on him. "I don't want trouble," Anthony said, his voice steady but laced with warning. Mark laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, come on! You're already famous. Might as well own it." The tension in the room was suffocating. Anthony's heart raced, his vision narrowing. He could feel the weight of his father's note in his pocket, the reminder to keep a low profile. But his patience was running out. Before he could respond, a teacher entered the cafeteria, her stern voice cutting through the silence. "Mark, that's enough," she said, her gaze hard. "Everyone, back to your lunch, now." The students dispersed reluctantly, but the damage was done. Anthony could feel the shift in the air. He wasn't just a new kid anymore. He was a target, and the Castellano name was a bullseye on his back. That night, as he wrapped his hands for another session at the gym, Anthony's mind raced. He couldn't hide from his family's reputation, but he refused to let it define him. As he stepped into the ring, Robert gave him a knowing look. "Whatever's eating at you, leave it out there," Robert said, nodding toward the door. "In. Here it's just you and the work." Anthony nodded, tightening his gloves. He knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be won with fists alone, but with discipline, determination, and the strength to choose his own path. The air in the boxing gym was heavy with the scent of sweat and determination. Anthony stood in front of the heavy bag, his fists pounding a rhythmic beat as his mind wrestled with the chaos unfolding around him. Every punch, jab, and hook felt like a declaration, not just of his strength, but of his resolve to carve out a life independent of his father's shadow. "Stay sharp, Anthony." Robert's voice cut through the thuds of fists on leather. He leaned against the ring ropes, watching closely. "If your focus slips out there, you lose. Keep your mind clear." Anthony grunted in response, adjusting his stance and delivering a precise uppercut. Robert nodded, his approval subtle but present. Anthony's progress was undeniable, but his troubles outside the gym weighed on him like a lead vest. At school, the whispers had turned into a storm. Mark, emboldened by the attention his rumors had garnered, continued to spread stories about Anthony's supposed connections to the Mafia. While some students kept their distance, others seemed fascinated, their stares laced with equal parts fear and intrigue. The shift in dynamics became glaringly obvious during biology class. Anthony sat at his usual desk, flipping through his textbook, while Mrs. Harper explained photosynthesis. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught Sarah, a soft-spoken girl who usually sat 2 rows behind him, hesitating near his desk. "Anthony," she asked quietly, her voice tentative. He looked up, surprised. Sarah rarely spoke, let alone approached him. I just wanted to say..." She glanced around nervously, then leaned in slightly. "I don't believe what they're saying about you." Anthony blinked, caught off guard. "You don't?" She shook her head, her gaze steady. "You don't seem like the person they're describing. I think people just like to make up stories because they're bored." Her words were a small but unexpected comfort. Anthony managed a faint smile. "Thanks. That means a lot." Before he could say more, Mark sauntered into the room, his presence as unwelcome as ever. He made a beeline for Anthony's desk, his smirk firmly in place. "Look at this," Mark said loudly, holding up his phone. The screen displayed yet another article about the Castellano family, the headlines bold and damning. "You've really got a legacy, don't you?" Anthony's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the class's attention on him, the room thick with silent anticipation. "I said leave it," Anthony replied, his voice low but firm. Mark leaned closer, his grin widening. Or what? You gonna call in some backup? Maybe Daddy's little soldiers. The classroom was deathly quiet, the tension palpable. Anthony could feel his hands clenching involuntarily, his knuckles white against the edge of the desk. But before the situation could escalate, Mrs. Harper intervened, her sharp voice breaking the spell. "Mark, that's enough. Sit down now." Mark rolled his eyes but obeyed, though not without shooting Anthony a smug look. The rest of the day passed in a blur. By the time Anthony returned home, he felt drained, his resolve worn thin. As he stepped through the front door, his mother greeted him with a concerned look. "Rough day?" she asked gently. "You could say that," Anthony muttered, dropping his bag by the door. His mother sighed, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Your father called." Anthony froze. "What did he say?" She hesitated, her expression carefully neutral. "He's concerned about the attention you're drawing. He wants to send someone to handle the situation." "No," Anthony said immediately, his voice firm. "I don't need his help. I can deal with this." His mother studied him for a moment, her eyes softening. "You're trying so hard to distance yourself from him, but Anthony, you can't fight every battle alone." "I'm not asking for help," he replied, his tone sharper than intended. "I just want to be left alone to figure this out my way." She didn't argue further, but the tension lingered like an unspoken warning. That evening, Anthony returned to the gym, desperate for an outlet. He worked the bags relentlessly, each punch a release for the frustration boiling inside him. By the time Robert called for a break, Anthony was drenched in sweat, his muscles aching. "Looks like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," Robert remarked, handing him a water bottle. Anthony took a long drink before answering. "Feels like it sometimes." Robert's gaze was steady, his tone measured. "You can't control what people think, kid. All you can do is control how you respond." Anthony nodded, though the advice felt easier said than done. The next few days brought a strange lull. Mark and his cronies seemed to back off, their taunts less frequent and less biting. For a moment, Anthony allowed himself to hope that things were finally settling down. But that hope shattered on a Friday night. Anthony had just finished his closing shift at the gym and was heading to his car when he noticed something was off. The lot was eerily quiet, the distant hum of streetlights the only sound. As he approached his car, he saw it. All four tires slashed, the rubber shredded beyond repair. Spray painted across the windshield in bold red letters was a single word: snitch. Anthony's chest tightened, a mixture of anger and unease flooding his senses. He scanned the shadows, his instincts on high alert. A low chuckle echoed from behind him, and he turned to see Mark, Dylan, and Brad emerging from the dark, their expressions smug and defiant. "Looks like you're walking home tonight," Mark sneered, twirling a pocket knife between his fingers. Anthony's fists clenched, his body tensing. He knew he couldn't fight all three of them, especially not with a blade in play. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Mark stepped closer, his grin widening. "Because someone needs to put you in your place. You think you can just waltz in here and scare everyone with your daddy's reputation? Not gonna happen." Anthony took a step back, calculating his options. He couldn't use his car, not with the tires ruined, and the gym was already locked up for the night. "Stay calm," he told himself, Robert's voice echoing in his mind. "Think, don't react." Summoning every ounce of self-control, Anthony held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just let me go, and we'll forget this happened." But Mark wasn't interested in peace. He lunged forward, the knife glinting in the dim light. Anthony dodged, narrowly avoiding the blade, and countered with a quick jab to Mark's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground, and for a split second, Anthony had the upper hand. But Dylan and Brad were already moving, grabbing Anthony and pinning his arms. He struggled against their grip, but they were stronger together. Mark picked up the knife, his face red with anger. "You just made a big mistake." Before he could do anything, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A car sped into the lot, its headlights blinding. The three boys froze as the vehicle came to. A sudden stop, the driver's door flying open. "Get off him!" a voice shouted. Anthony squinted, recognizing the figure stepping out of the car. It was Robert, his expression fierce as he advanced toward them. Mark hesitated, his bravado faltering. With a curse, he motioned for Dylan and Brad to let go. Three of them bolted into the night, leaving Anthony slumped against his car. "You okay?" Robert asked, his tone softening. Anthony nodded, though his body trembled with residual adrenaline. "Yeah, thanks for showing up." Robert gave him a wry smile. "I figured you might need backup." As Anthony looked at his slashed tires and the vandalized windshield, a realization struck him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time he wasn't facing it alone. The early morning sun broke through the blinds in Anthony's room, but the warm light did little to dispel the tension that hung over him. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his bruised knuckles, a painful reminder of the confrontation. In the parking lot, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, breaking his trance. He picked it up to see a text from Robert. "Meet me at the gym. Got something to talk about." Anthony sighed, tossing the phone onto the bed. He couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the previous night had only scratched the surface of what Mark and his friends were capable of. After dressing quickly, he slipped out of the house, careful not to wake his mother. The gym was quiet when he arrived, the only sound the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Robert stood in the center of the ring, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Morning, kid," Robert said as Anthony approached. "Morning," Anthony replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. Robert motioned for Anthony to join him. "In the ring, we need to talk about last night." Anthony climbed through the ropes, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't ask you to show up." "No," Robert said, his tone firm, "but you were lucky I did. You're walking a fine line, Anthony. Those kids aren't just trying to scare you anymore. This is getting dangerous." "I can handle it," Anthony insisted, though even he wasn't convinced by his own words. Robert stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You're strong, but strength doesn't mean much if you don't use your head. What happens when they come at you with something worse than a knife?" "What then?" Anthony didn't answer. He hated feeling vulnerable, but Robert wasn't wrong. "Here's the deal," Robert continued. "If you want to keep training here, you need to promise me you'll be smart about this. No more fights unless you have no other choice. Got it?" Anthony hesitated, then nodded. "Got it." "Good." Robert clapped him on the shoulder, his stern expression softening. "Now let's get to work." The training session was brutal, leaving Anthony's muscles screaming by the end. But for the first time in days, he felt a sliver of clarity. The following week at school, Anthony's resolve was tested almost immediately. Mark, Dylan, and Brad kept their distance, but their stares burned with unspoken threats. The rumor mill had only intensified, fueled by the parking lot incident. Every glance in Anthony's direction felt like a silent accusation, a reminder that he would never escape his father's legacy. Things took a turn during the school's Friday night football game. The stands were packed, the energy electric, as Westbrook's team faced off against their longtime rivals. Anthony had no interest in football, but Sarah had convinced him to attend, promising that a change of scenery might help clear his head. The first half of the game passed uneventfully. Anthony sat near the edge of the bleachers, half listening to Sarah's commentary while trying to ignore the stares from other students. Then he saw them. Mark, Dylan, and Brad were huddled near the concession stand, their heads bent together in what looked like a heated discussion. Anthony's stomach twisted with unease. "Hey," Sarah said, noticing his distraction. "What's wrong?" Anthony shook his head. "Nothing. I just need some air." Before she could respond, he slipped away, weaving through the crowd until he was out of sight. He kept his distance as he followed Mark and his friends, careful not to attract their attention. The trio made their way to the back of the school, where the noise of the game faded into the background. Anthony hung back, watching from the shadows as they pulled something out of a duffel bag. Spray paint cans. His chest tightened as he realized what they were planning. The back wall of the gymnasium, freshly painted earlier that month, was about to become their canvas. Idiots, Anthony muttered under his breath. He didn't want to confront them, but he couldn't let them vandalize school property either. He stepped out of the shadows. "What are you doing?" The three of them froze, their heads snapping toward him. Mark recovered first, his trademark smirk returning. "Look who decided to join the party," he said, shaking a can of spray paint. "Leave," Anthony said, his voice steady but firm. "Now." Dylan laughed nervously. "What are you gonna do? Call your dad?" Anthony took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "You've got 5 seconds to walk away." Brad glanced at Mark, uncertainty flickering across his face. But Mark wasn't backing down. He stepped forward, the can of spray paint still in hand. "Or what?" he challenged. Before Anthony could respond, the distant sound of approaching voices reached their ears. A group of parents, likely returning from the concession stand, was heading in their direction. Mark cursed under his breath. "Let's go," he hissed, shoving the can back into the bag. The trio hurried off, their plan foiled. Anthony exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something on the ground, a single can of spray paint left behind in their haste. He picked it up, staring at it for a moment before tucking it into his pocket. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Anthony couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Mark and his friends were growing bolder, and it was only a matter of time before they tried something worse. Back at home, Anthony placed the spray can on his desk, its bright red label standing out against the clutter. It was a small victory, but it felt like a step in the right direction. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Anthony made a decision. He wouldn't let Mark and his friends dictate his life, but he also wouldn't stoop to their level. If they wanted to drag him down, they'd have to work a lot harder. For now, he had a plan. Stay focused, stay smart, and prove to everyone, including himself, that he was more than just a Castellano. The tension had reached a breaking point. Over the past week, the incidents had escalated. Taunting messages scratched into Anthony's locker, whispered threats in the hallways, and now the spray-painted word Mafia emblazoned across the side of the gym. Anthony had walked into school that morning to find students gathered around the graffiti, their murmurs a chorus of rumors and speculation. "It's about him," someone whispered, gesturing subtly toward Anthony. "He probably did it himself." "To scare everyone," another suggested. Anthony ignored them, keeping his head down as he walked to class. But the unease followed him, coiling tighter with each passing hour. He knew Mark and his friends were behind the vandalism, but proving it was another matter. By lunchtime, the whispers had transformed into outright stares. Even Sarah, who had been a steady source of support, seemed uneasy. "Anthony," she said softly, as they sat together at their usual spot, "maybe it's time to tell someone about this." He shook his head, his jaw set. "And what? Give them more ammunition? If I tell the principal, it'll just make things worse." Sarah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Just don't let them push you too far." The warning lingered in Anthony's mind long after the bell rang. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Anthony found himself back at the gym. The rhythmic pounding of his fists against the heavy bag was the only thing keeping his thoughts in check. Robert watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You're distracted," Robert said, after a particularly sloppy combination. Anthony stopped, leaning against the bag as he caught his breath. I can't focus. It's like every move I make, they're right there, waiting to knock me down. Robert stepped closer, his tone firm but not unkind. You're letting them control the fight. That's the first mistake. If you keep reacting to their moves, you'll never take the upper hand. Anthony frowned. So what do I do? Robert tapped his temple. Think ahead, predict their next move, and be ready for it. That's how you win. The advice resonated, though Anthony wasn't sure how to apply it. But as he walked home later that night, his mind churned with possibilities. 2 days later, during a quiet afternoon at school, Anthony spotted Mark and his friends huddled by the rear entrance of the building. He stayed out of sight, watching, as they passed a familiar duffel bag between them. His stomach tightened as he realized what was happening. They were planning something, and it wasn't going to be small. Anthony didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he waited, observing their movements and piecing together their plan. By the time the final bell rang, he had a good idea of what they were up to. That night, he returned to the gym, seeking clarity in the rhythm of his training. But as he worked the speed bag, a thought struck him, a way to turn the tables. The following day, Anthony arrived at school early, a calm determination in his step. He headed straight to the janitor's closet, borrowing a set of tools without permission. With careful precision, he loosened the screws on one of the back doors, rendering it nearly impossible to open without force. By lunchtime, his suspicions were confirmed. Mark and his friends had planned to sneak into the school after hours, using the rear entrance to stage their next act of vandalism. But when they tried the door, it refused to budge. "What the hell?" Mark muttered, jiggling the handle. Dylan frowned, glancing around nervously. "Maybe we should just forget it. This is getting risky." Mark shot him a glare. "We're not backing down. There's another way in. Come on." Anthony, watching from a safe distance, allowed himself a small smile. He followed them at a distance, staying in the shadows as they moved toward the side of the building. The trio found another door, this one leading to the gymnasium. They jimmied the lock open, their laughter echoing softly in the empty hallway. Anthony waited until they disappeared inside before slipping into the building behind them. The gym was dark and eerily silent, the faint sound of spray cans shaking breaking the stillness. Anthony crept closer, keeping to the shadows as he watched them begin their work. Mark was the first to notice him. He froze mid-spray, his eyes narrowing. "You again?" Anthony stepped into the light, his expression calm but resolute. "This ends now," Mark smirked, tossing the spray can aside. "Or what? You gonna call your daddy's goons?" "I don't need anyone else to deal with you," Anthony replied. His voice was steady, but his heart raced. Dylan and Brad moved to flank him, their postures threatening. But Anthony didn't back down. He'd been preparing for this moment, and he wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. Mark lunged first, his movements wild and uncoordinated. Anthony sidestepped easily, landing a sharp jab to Mark's ribs that sent him stumbling. Dylan was next, charging with more force but less strategy. Anthony ducked under his swing, pivoting to deliver a calculated hook that left Dylan dazed. Brad hesitated, his confidence faltering as he watched his friends struggle. But Mark's shout spurred him into action, and he came at Anthony with everything he had. The fight was brutal and messy, but Anthony's training made the difference. He stayed calm, his movements deliberate and precise. By the time it was over, Mark and his friends were on the ground, nursing their bruises and glaring up at him with a mixture of anger and fear. "You've had your fun," Anthony said, his voice firm. "But if you come after me again, you'll regret it." Mark spat a curse, but he didn't argue. He knew when he was beaten. As Anthony walked away, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he'd faced his fears head-on and come out stronger. The next morning, the school buzzed with whispers about the fight. Word spread quickly, and by lunchtime, Anthony found himself at the center of attention. But this time, the stares were different. Less judgmental, more curious, Sarah approached him cautiously, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" Anthony nodded, a faint smile playing at his lips. "I will be." Though the challenges weren't over, Anthony felt a newfound sense of control. He couldn't change his past or his family's reputation, but he could define his own future. And for the first time, that future felt within reach.
If you enjoyed the story and want to see more content like this, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications.